Okay, so let me thank you. Good morning, and thank you everyone for attending. Let me introduce Dr. Khalid Saqr today. So Dr. Saqr is a former visiting professor at the Institute of Fluid Science, Tohoku University, Japan, and he's a technology advisor to ClinicalMatch in the United States, Vascula Life in the UK, and Medtech Ventures in Brussels. Dr. Saqr is a fluid dynamics professor, entrepreneur, and simulation expert. He is a co-founder of Bio-CFD, a US-based computational fluid dynamics startup, democratizing CFD in the medicine and life science fields. Welcome, Khalid, and we are looking forward to hearing all about your work.
Thank you very much, Hoda. Thank you for the invitation. The lecture actually summarizes my research for the past 6 or 7 years on vascular hemodynamics. I came into the field as a fluid dynamicist with a strong background in turbulence modeling, and I had a different approach to study vascular hemodynamics, and I would be happy to share my approach and to share my findings so far. So the lecture basically deals with a story that has a discovery of some problems in the hemodynamics field, and the evidence that my research group and I managed to substantiate on these problems, and then a proposed solution to shift the stalling paradigm that hasn't really produced a disease-modifying therapy for vascular disease for the past 4 decades. Vascular disease is actually a general term that includes a spectrum of conditions such as cardiovascular and cerebrovascular disease, which share common etiology and lead to loss of flow transport functions of the circulatory system. There are many ways to classify vascular disease. Any classification associates disease progression with blood flow dynamics in what is known as the vascular hemodynamics research field. By notation, vascular disease can be classified according to local anatomy, as shown in this figure, neurovascular, pulmonary vascular disease, cardiovascular disease, and so on. It's actually this whole group of conditions. They constitute the world's leading cause of death. Every year, more than 18 million people die from vascular disease and complications such as coronary heart disease, cerebral aneurysm, ischemic stroke, and aortic heart disease. It's actually a staggering death toll compared to COVID, for example. It's almost 6 times higher than the annual death from COVID-19 in the past 2 years. The global cost of vascular disease represents 11% of the global health spending, according to 2020 statistics. The cost is expected to head north of $1 trillion by 2030, this is like all what we know about the cost of vascular disease, but definitely there are more hidden costs that do not come in these kind of statistics. So to revisit the classification of vascular disease according to the host member of the circulatory system, the circulatory system has 3 categories of host members to vascular disease, which are the lymphatic system, the vein system, and the arteries. So my lecture is focused on the arterial conditions, the arterial disease. For the purpose of this lecture, I would like to introduce a subsidiary classification based on the loss of transport function, because the circulatory system basically has a primary function, which is to transport blood from one organ to another. So the loss of transport function can be seen as 2 main categories. Something that happens due to vascular remodeling, pathologic vascular remodeling, such as aneurysm, stenosis, atherosclerosis, and embolic events of embolism, like thrombogenic reactions, when you have a blood clot that blocks an artery and leading it to lose its transport function. Actually, all the arterial conditions, specifically vascular remodeling conditions, they share a common root, which is endothelial dysfunction. So basically, our arteries are composed of 3 or 4 layers. The innermost layer is called the vascular endothelium, which is composed of endothelial cells. And the function of endothelial cells is to protect the vascular tissues and subsequent layers from interacting with different particles in the bloodstream. Endothelial cells, amazingly, they have a mechanosensory function. They sense blood flow dynamics, and then they translate this flow signals to biologic cascades, which can be healthy if the conditions are physiologic, natural, normal, or disease-promoting if they are pathologic conditions, pathologic flow conditions. Since endothelial dysfunction is a common factor in almost all vascular disease conditions, it's critically important to unfold its complexity in order to gain complete understanding of the progression of vascular disease. Unfolding the endothelial dysfunction poses an array of key questions that require coherent answers to explain the phenomenology of vascular disease. If you can see the figure in 3B, different blood flow phenomena such as recirculation, vortex precision, transition, they have been correlated to different and various mechanobiological reactions in endothelial cells. To sum up this kind of complex interaction between blood flow and endothelial cells, we know that the relationship between endothelial dysfunction as a disease and blood flow regulates pathologic vascular remodeling. It's a two-way coupling between vascular pathobiology and blood flow through the endothelial mechanosensory function and cascade. Nonetheless, the exact mechanisms and pathways and cascades associated with such two-way coupling remain largely unknown. That's actually one of the pure scientific motivations behind the work presented in this lecture. The importance of this problem regarding the interaction between endothelial dysfunction and blood flow appears clearly when we study the management protocols that we have now for different stages of vascular disease. And through 5 decades of research, scientists were able to develop management pipelines to treat different conditions of vascular disease. In more early stage cases, risk management drugs such as antithrombotic agents, diuretics, and lipid-lowering drugs are used to mitigate the progression of vascular disease. In later stage, when the disease progresses, endovascular intervention is usually used to repair damaged arteries by implanting grafts, stents, or using catheter balloons or coils in the condition of intracranial aneurysm, for example. In some conditions, when an aneurysm ruptures, there is a dissection in an aortic aneurysm or something like that, direct surgical intervention is necessary to save the patient alive. And actually, this is quite interesting because unlike many other diseases, we still do not have a disease-modifying medicine to reverse endothelial dysfunction. And actually, the question is why? Why do we don't have a disease-modifying drug that the patient can take and stop the progression of endothelial dysfunction and hence the remaining cascade of vascular pathology. The discovery of endothelial mechanosensory function happened in the late 1960s, early 70s, when scientists noticed that when they subject an in vitro culture of endothelial cells to flow, their behavior changes. And the main question that was asked in the early days of this research field was how to characterize the correlation between flow dynamics and endothelial mechanosensory. The historical work of Kroger and his co-workers, shown here on this slide, poses a question about the controversial relationship between shear stress and endothelial injury. At this time, in the late 60s, the fluid mechanics and fluid dynamics field was not as mature as it is today. Most of the work done on turbulence was done in Russia in the late 1940s, early 50s, particularly the work of Kolmogorov, the work of Obukhov. It was not nearly or fully translated at the time, and scientists tended to choose shear stress, which is the viscous term on the right-hand side of the Stokes equation, as the link that they should follow to correlate the blood flow and endothelial mechanosensory. That question was posed in 1971, and it became the founding question behind an entire research field. This is a diagram showing the hierarchy of the research field as it grew over 5 decades and became the hemodynamics, vascular hemodynamics field that we all try to advance. You can see that now scientists have in vivo frameworks that encompass animal models, endovascular biopsy, radiological measurements. We also have in vitro framework with flow experiments like the work that Ohta is doing in her lab of vascular phantoms and endothelial cell cultures. We also have in silico framework, which uses computational fluid dynamics, which is my main field of expertise, to explore vascular blood flow. Despite more than 40 years of research and thousands of published papers and hundreds of millions in research funding, the same question that was posed in 1971 remained unanswered until today. Until today, we still do not have a universal answer to the role of wall shear stress in different vascular disease conditions. To explore why such question persisted for so many decades, my colleagues and I have carried out a meta-analysis and review of more than 1,700 papers about intracranial aneurysm. If you can actually scan this QR code, you can easily download the paper from Journal of Cerebral Blood Flow and Metabolism. We focused on intracranial aneurysm because it's a very unique vascular condition where a very light protrusion in one of the main arteries of the brain appears and could lead to subalkaloid hemorrhage and to death, actually. It's better known as brain aneurysm. I think President Biden had a couple of brain aneurysm in the 1980s, and at that time they didn't have endovascular devices, so they actually operated an actual surgery to fix the brain aneurysm, and apparently it's working very fine until now. So when we actually analyzed the body of literature of 1,700 papers, we found that the CFD research framework has serious shortcomings when it comes to representing what is really happening in vivo in an in silico model. Our paper was described by the reviewers as a Conian revolution in hemodynamics, and it actually revealed epistemic shortcomings related to the mechanistic paradigm of vascular hemodynamics. We identified the main shortcomings as 3 groups of oversimplified assumptions. The first one is related to blood flow modeling because it was assumed to be physiologically laminar. The second group of shortcomings related to the whole blood viscosity because there is a misconception very common in the field that at high to moderate shear rates, blood behaves as a Newtonian assumption, which is not really the case. Another problem that we found that a large group of studies were done using steady-state flow models, which do not represent the actual transient conditions associated with the heart as a positive displacement pump. These shortcomings are actually priori assumptions. They have been assumed based on physical reasoning without sufficient supporting evidence. This figure shows statistics of such assumptions in the body of scientific literature related to intracranial aneurysm. It is evident that these assumptions have formed what has been known for decades as the standard vascular hemodynamics model of brain aneurysm used to characterize vascular pathology. Another major problem has been revealed in our meta-analysis concerning the in vivo radiological measurements of arterial dimensions, flow rates. This figure shows statistics from more than 50 papers for the main cerebral arteries. You can see that the standard deviation for the flow rate and diameter measurements is as high as the mean values, making the measurements unreliable for providing accurate universal overview for the flow regime, even based on the improper steady flow model. So our overall criticism of the present mechanistic paradigm can be described as following. The shortcomings of the mechanistic paradigm impedes the progress of in silico disease models and endothelial cell flow experiments. The first issue in this criticism is about the flow regime, the improper flow regime classification, which was established based on Reynolds' theory of a steady Newtonian flow, made the CFD disease models too abstract and lack sufficient physical characteristics to match in vivo radiological measurements. So basically, at the early days, engineers who were involved in analyzing the in vitro flow phantoms used by medical doctors, they applied the Reynolds criteria. So they said, if the Reynolds number is below the threshold of the famous threshold of 2,200, it's a laminar flow. So actually, this criteria was derived for steady Newtonian flow, not multi-harmonic, pulsatile, non-Newtonian flow. In the same time, this improper assumption impeded the development of realistic endothelial cell flow chambers. So what scientists do is that they design small flow chambers. They use it as to host endothelial cell cultures, and they subject it to flow. And based on this improper assumption, they designed improper devices. The second part of our criticism regarding the viscosity, as I mentioned, and the third part is about, which is actually the foundation of the paradigm shift that we are proposing. It's about turbulence, because the reliance on Kolmogorov-Obukhov theory for fully developed isotropic homogeneous turbulence widened the gap between CFD models and in vivo observations. To sum up this criticism, this is actually why we do not have disease-modifying drugs for endothelial dysfunction, because the mechanistic paradigm that everybody uses to study endothelial dysfunction is not the proper one. So that's why we have a drug discovery crisis. We are unable to discover the effective drug targets that could really modify endothelial dysfunction. Another problem which actually took many years to try to convince people about it, because it's a very solid thing in hemodynamics now. It's about the wall shear stress. Wall shear stress is a scalar tensor field in the Navier-Stokes equation. What that means is due to the isotropy and symmetry of the Stokes hypothesis, the shear stress tensor has only 6 components, not 9. So basically, it has 3 normal stress components and 3 shear stress components. So basically, it doesn't have any directionality. There is no direction for wall shear stress. When people talk about wall shear stress vector, they basically map the scalar field to the geometry vector. And that's how they end up with directions in wall shear stress. But intrinsically, it doesn't have a direction, meaning that if you slightly change the geometry, the direction will change. which is actually constituting another problem in vitro models, in endothelial cell in vitro models, because endothelial cells respond to flow direction. So having wall shear stress as the primary parameter will never lead to unfold this mechanosensory function that is related to flow direction. So let me present 3 pieces of evidence that we published over the last couple of years to support our criticism of the existing paradigm of vascular hemodynamics. The first one is talking about the turbulence nature of pulsatile flow, multi-harmonic pulsatile flow. So basically, the main difference between laminar and turbulent flow are the characteristics of turbulence flow, because there is no universal definition of turbulence. So laminar flow tends to conserve kinetic energy. It does not lose kinetic energy because it does not have intermittent events. Turbulent flow, on the other hand, it exhibits the well-known kinetic energy cascade, which has been described by the Kolmogorov theory. The second difference between laminar and turbulent flow is that laminar flow does not or is not sensitive to initial conditions. Turbulent flow exhibits what we call chaotic nature. It is very sensitive to initial conditions. And the third property is about global instability. Turbulent flows are globally unstable, while laminar flows are globally stable. So in this paper that was published in Scientific Reports a couple of years ago, we provided evidence from the exact solution of the Navier-Stokes equation, the Windmill flow, and from in vivo measurements and from chaos theory to support the argument that physiologic blood flow is by nature turbulent. It cannot be treated as a laminar flow. The second part of the evidence is coming from laser measurements, from PIV measurements that we did for a couple of brain aneurysm phantoms, brain aneurysm models. One is rigid and the other one is elastic, with the same elasticity that is similar to human arteries. As you can see in the comparison between points C and M, which you can see here, this is C, this is M. So basically M sorry, this is M. M in the jet layer of the flow, while C is in the vortex near to the vortex core region of the aneurysm. You can see here that the flow around point M is laminar flow. You can see that there is no kinetic energy loss, there is no kinetic energy cascade, while in point C, you can see that there is a kinetic energy cascade, and the slope of the cascade is not an actually subject of the Kolmogorov theory. It does not apply to Kolmogorov scaling laws. The third part of the evidence is a large eddy simulation study that we carried out on carotid stenosis of an elderly patient in Japan who had carotid stenting and angioplasty. So we studied the carotid flow before the procedure and 1 year after the procedure, and we could actually prove again that the regime of turbulence that we can find in physiologic and pathologic conditions are not subject of the Kolmogorov theory. So basically, you cannot use turbulence models. You cannot assume that frequency and length scale are correlated using Taylor theory. So you basically lose all the knowledge that is related to turbulent flow from the Kolmogorov theory, and you end up with a new turbulent regime. It's called non-Kolmogorov turbulence, and you end up with very little tools to study it. You can see here the viscosity, because the flow was non-Newtonian. So you can see the viscosity in point upstream of the stenosis, and downstream, you can see how the carotid stenting and angioplasty stabilizes the viscous interactions because of the because it treated the constriction that is coming from the stenosis, and you can actually also see here on the velocity the same effect as well. So another piece of evidence that we have recently published with my colleague here in Egypt, one of my colleagues in Egypt, we studied multi-harmonic pulse time flow in a straight pipe. It's a very simple study. So we basically constructed three models. One of them has one harmonic of flow, just a sine wave, and the second one has two harmonics, and the third one has three harmonics. And each one of the models, we simulated Newtonian and non-Newtonian flow. If you can see here, the kinetic energy cascade at the center of the pipe, and just 10 microns away from the pipe, you can see that the slope of the kinetic energy cascade changes in space. Another sign of non-collimative turbulence, and you can also see that there is no inertial subrange, and there is another plateau that you can see here, which is coming from the secondary vortices that appear due to the interaction between the pulse style flow and the wall, because there is a large vertical structure that appears due to the absence of the fully developed boundary layer. So now we came to a point that we have a valid criticism for the old paradigm, and we would like to introduce a new paradigm to replace the old one, so we get closer to discover a disease-modifying drug by having better models, better devices to do drug discovery research. So to do that, we actually have to start from a point that is quite different from the old paradigm. So we need a new mechanistic paradigm to replace the expired one. So we need a new flow field variable that must be derived to correlate vascular flow with the endothelial mechanobiology. The new flow field variable must have three conditions. It must be derived based on a physical reasoning that is related to the near wall flow, because this is where everything happens. And it must also be envisaged to avoid repeating the same mistakes that happen with the wall shear stress thing. So we need to move away from the viscous term of the Navier-Stokes equation, and we need to get more to the acceleration term on the left-hand side. And it must be relatable to momentum transfer. So it would be correlated with the non-Kolmogorov turbulence that we observed experimentally and computationally in physiologic and pathologic flows. So to do that, I actually had to start from a very old version of the Navier-Stokes equation that was derived by Veronica in the 19th century. Veronica was actually one of the founding fathers of fluid mechanics, and he was the first one to decompose the convective acceleration term to a vorticity acceleration and a kinetic energy cascade terms. So basically, the Veronica-Lamb acceleration vector equals the vorticity as the cross product of vorticity and velocity. So you basically end up with an acceleration vector that appears in the new form of the Navier-Stokes equation that is actually a product, or actually the product between kinetic energy, Veronica-Lamb acceleration vector and the gradient of kinetic energy. So the acceleration, the Veronica acceleration vector has a units of acceleration. So and also it has three components as a vector. So it basically have complete vector properties. It has directions in X and Y and Z, and it represents the acceleration of a vortex, linear acceleration of a vortex. So to demonstrate the feasibility of using the Veronicas Lab vortex force field in wall-bounded flows, because it has a long history in physical oceanography, in free flows, in free stream flows. I managed to solve the two of the classical exact solutions of the Navier-Stokes equation, which are the wet flow and the Poiseuille flow in planar and circular coordinates. This is the solution. The y-axis is the distance from the wall, and the x-axis is the vortex force in piconewton units. So basically, it's the density multiplied by the integral of the Veronicas Lab acceleration vector. So you can see that in wet flow and planar and circular Poiseuille flow, and in the physiologic Reynolds number regime from 100 to 1000, the vortex force, which is, you can think of it as a force normal to the wall and oscillates with time. It's like a continuous hammering to the wall. But because wet and Poiseuille flow are steady flows, there is no time derivative here. So you can see that they have the vortex force field in both flows. It has values that can be measured in piconewton forces, and this is very interesting because there is an entire body of research regarding endothelial cell mechanosensory and mechanofunction in response to piconewton forces. So scientists, many groups, they applied laser tweezers to single endothelial cells, and they measure the force and they measure the response. So basically, this is some sort of a physical reason that we were looking for. And since the Veronicas Lab vector is an inviscid invariant of the Navier-Stokes equation, it's part of the acceleration term, so it doesn't have any relationship with viscosity. So this is the future research agenda that we are currently developing to bring the vortex force as the new vascular hemodynamics paradigm. And we have planned for experimental characterization of the vortex force in patient-specific phantoms in ideal models. We are also carrying out CFD models with this formulation as our object function. So we basically observe the vortex acceleration in 3 dimensions using large scale simulation and non-Newtonian flow models. And we have actually connected with a medical device company to develop a new generation of endothelial cell chambers that can be used as a replacement for the parallel plate chambers that are currently being used to study endothelial cells in order to discover better drug targets. We hope that within the coming 3 to 5 years, our work on the vortex force and the new paradigm will lead to a discovery of disease-modifying drug targets for endothelial dysfunction and eventually find an ultimate treatment for endothelial dysfunction. I'm done with my presentation, so please, if you have any questions, it will be my pleasure to answer all the questions.
Thank you, Khalid. That was fantastic. We're gonna take questions. Please ask the questions or type them in the chat so we can ask Dr. Saqr. Maybe I can start with a question. So Khalid, how do you translate the rheological properties of blood in your patient-specific simulations? Because I basically, after the comments that you made that the viscosity models that you used are not the ones that are currently available in literature. So how exactly do you translate that? And is it a patient-specific situation, or is it like a developed model that is general?
So we basically use, we have two sets of models that we use. We use Kero-Yasuda model. It's one of the well-known models in our publications to show that our work is reproducible, so everybody else can repeat the study. But we also have a patient-specific whole blood viscosity model that correlates non-Newtonian viscosity to platelet count and RBC count. So we with basically a normal CBC of a patient with a platelet count and RBC count, we can actually reproduce the non-Newtonian viscosity of the patient in situ.
Thank you. Selene, go ahead.
First of all, thank you so much. This was very, very interesting, a great lecture. And so my question is more about your plans for the future, because running LES simulation, it's very challenging and time consuming. So I was wondering, how do you plan to, how have you planned out your research in order to be able to run enough simulation to actually come up with some kind of correlation between, you know, your vortex force results and your results in terms of, you know, what happens to these endothelial cells?
Thank you very much, Selena, for the question. So basically, what we do with large language simulation is that we create models that solve at least 90% of the turbulence budget of the problem by applying Pope criteria. We end up with models that are around a couple of million cells. To keep the current number below unity, we apply time step less than 1 millisecond, probably half millisecond. So to benchmark the solution of this kind of setups, you can actually run it on a 32-core, 32 CPU machine. It will take like a couple of days to solve. If you have bigger computational resources, it definitely gets done in a couple of hours or 3 hours. So from my experience, it's not, I mean, looking at today's computers and today HPCs, if you get like an Amazon EC3 or something, it's not really that expensive. So what we did is that we coded the vortex formulation, the vortex force formulation as an object function. So it actually takes the vorticity and velocity field and gets the cross product and gets the three components and the magnitude and the angles in the runtime. So usually the simulations take like 2 or 3 days to continue. So it's not really that expensive in terms of computational resources. So is that the answer to your question? Did I get it right?
Yes, that answers my question. I was just wondering because I have experience running it on running LES on bigger geometries like aortic, and it takes a lot of time. So you indeed answered my question.
Yeah, with aortic, it takes a long time because the Reynolds number is high and you have higher computational grid than ours. We mainly study the intracranial circulation because the intracranial circulation has many advantages when it comes to modeling. The effect of the wall can be reasonably neglected, so we don't have to use FSI. And the Reynolds number is at least 4 times less than the aortic flow, so it takes less computational resources. That's why we focus our research more on the circle of Willis.
But then if I can ask a follow-up question, is it correct to assume that you know, this type of conclusion can be then translated to other cardiovascular districts?
Absolutely, but we just don't have the resources to do it now.
Yeah.
But absolutely, it can be translated. But so far, we are focused on the circle of Willis because we have the resources to study it.
Yeah, thank you. I understand that.
Jeremiah?
Thank you very much, Khalid, for the presentation. I was just wondering, I've been working on hemodynamics for a while, and I found that the MRI 4D flow images, they're very promising because they can capture velocity flows inside these vessels in a 3D volume. But they failed when you have a very high Reynolds number. I found that they are very poor in characterizing turbulence. So I was curious about your results that you said that you measured. So what kind of measure did you use? Are you aware of this lack of representation of turbulence that the MRI has? So what kind of measurements did you use in your work? That's my question.
Measurements, well, we have our own PIV system in Japan, in Ohta Lab. So we use these measurements to validate our CFD models. So we don't use MRI measurements because they are very coarse. So we like to use laser measurements for validation.
So laser is not it's in silico models, isn't it?
It's in vitro, in vitro.
Okay, okay. But
in vitro. So basically, we take the geometry and use 3D printing to make a mold, and then we use the mold to produce an optically accessible model. And then we have a flow system that can reproduce the cardiac harmonics, and we use a blood surrogate fluid that is also optically accessible, and repeat it and get the measurements and use it for CFD validation.
Okay, okay. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one.
Yes, please.
Hi, thanks for the nice talk. This is Karthik Iyer here. Do you have a phenomenological argument for why your spectral slope is the value, the non-5/3 value you prescribe there in your plot?
Could you please repeat the question again?
The spectral slope is non-5/3 or non-Kolmogorov value, right? So why is it the value that you show? Is there a physical argument for that?
I don't know. I don't know. We still do not have a theory for non-Kolmogorov turbulence because Kolmogorov-Obukhov theory assumes isotropic, homogeneous, fully developed turbulence. So this is not the case in physiological flows. So without the theoretical framework of Kolmogorov and Obukhov, Kreisner, and I mean all the frameworks that were devised for this regime of turbulence, if you lose these frameworks, there is nothing left to analyze the results. So basically, we cannot even present the kinetic energy cascade in wave number. We can only present it in frequency because we cannot apply Taylor hypothesis. So we need all the help we can get to answer your question.
Okay, sounds like we don't have any more questions. Thank you so much, Khalid. It was really fun. It was a fantastic talk. We really enjoyed it. And thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you, Hoda. Thank you very much.